Okay, welcome everybody to the Circle of Wine Writers Let's Talk series number 113. And today's topic is an introduction to regenerative viticulture. I'd like to extend a welcome to all our members and those that are joining us for the first time, and also those of you who are non-members. As a little bit of background, the Circle of Wine Writers was founded in 1960 in the UK and today has over 270 members, including wine writers, educators, broadcasters, and other professional communicators. The global membership is now split 50-50 between the UK and overseas. There's more information about the organisation on our website and also details there about how you can join online. In the meantime, I'd now like to hand over to Meg Maker, our chair, who will introduce our speakers today. Over to you, Meg.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're hailing from. I'm Meg Maker, the chair of the Circle. I'm enthusiastic about today's talk. I think it's really a vital topic, and I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today. Justin Howard-Sneyd, Master of Wine, is a trustee of the Regenerative Viticulture Foundation. He began his career in the wine industry in the 1990s as an itinerant winemaker, but then in 1997 became the wine buyer for Safeway, Sainsbury's, and Waitrose in sequence before becoming global wine director for direct sales with Laithwaite. In 2013, he became an independent consultant, and he returned to his winemaking roots with his own 4-hectare project in Roussillon, Domaine of the Bee. He now teaches at West Dean College in Sussex and advocates for regenerative viticulture practices globally, and he's on the board of Regenerative Viticulture Foundation. Becky Sykes is program director for the RGF, responsible for research, education, and engagement. Becky earned a bachelor's in aerospace engineering and a master of science in viticulture and enology, and worked as a public affairs consultant before assuming the role at RBF. In her present capacity, she supports producers in their efforts to farm regeneratively, developing and sharing resources and tools with them. Becky also manages research projects and spreads awareness of regenerative viticulture among wine educators and others, helping to build a community network of support. I've been subscribed to RVF's newsletter for some time, and I can personally report that it's chock full of important news, information, links, and stories. It's incredibly useful to everyone here on the call. So please join me in welcoming Becky and Justin. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Justin Howard-Sneyd here. I don't know if you can see me because I'm not sure I've joined the meeting as part of the presenting team. Can you see me? Can all the delegates see me or not? Does this matter? Yeah, I can. I've got a thumbs up.
We can see you. We can see your face and we can see your PowerPoint.
Fantastic. Well, that's good to know for those of you who can. And for those of you who can't, you've got away with a lucky escape. Welcome. Becky and I are here to talk to you for as long as, well, we're going to talk for about 40 minutes, I think, and then field some questions at the end. And I hope there will be some questions. Becky's driving the presentation, so I've got to try and remember what's coming up on the next slide. I think we've been adequately introduced, and I hope that Anne Jones might be joining us towards the end. I've actually got to rush off just before 6 o'clock, so hopefully Anne will be able to join Becky and be able to field any other questions that you have. Just to start off with, it'd be really interesting to introduce the foundation and what we're set up to do. So it was founded by Stephen Cronk. Stephen is an English producer of Provence Rosé, who for the first 15 or so years of producing Mirabeau sourced it from producers and makers down in the south of France. But about 5 years ago, he decided to invest in his own vineyard. And when he was doing so, he couldn't find out information about how to farm it beyond organically. He wanted to be organic, but he didn't feel that was enough. And he wanted to understand what regenerative had to offer in the world of viticulture. But he couldn't find out any information. So he decided to found a foundation to promote and broadcast information about what regenerative means. And that's what we've spent the last 4 or so years doing, creating a foundation and spreading our work. So that our vision is that we're working with nature to create a sustainable future for vineyards, growers, and the planet. And we want to do that through inspiring growers to transition towards regenerative viticulture using the 3 pillars of science, communication, and support for growers. So that is the remit of the foundation. It's what we set out to do. So yeah, we were established in 2021 as a UK-based nonprofit, And we have a very good supporter base who funded us. So we don't require membership fees. We don't require people to join up or do anything more than just join the mailing list for free. And we are promoting and spreading the word about regenerative methods. We're also working with quite a lot of like-minded organisations. So we do work with Sustainable Wine Roundtable, International Wine for Climate Action, etc. You can see the logos along the top there. Our intention is to be the vineyard experts, and what we want to set out is what we think is the best practice viticulture. And I think in helping you, all of you, and I know that lots of you have seen quite a few familiar names on the chat, what I'd really like to sort of emphasize, I think, is that this is not a new and unusual and different and extra thing to have to learn about. Our belief is that regenerative thinking and regenerative practices will form the best practice viticulture in the future and will overlap with conventional and sustainable and organic and biodynamic practices, and that all of those different buckets into which people sit, or certification levels perhaps, can learn a lot from thinking regeneratively. And I hope in the course of this 40 minutes or so that Becky and I will talk to you, that we will get across what that is. And I think Becky's going to cover the detail in terms of actual vineyard practices. And I'm just going to introduce the concepts at the beginning and explain how it fits in. So let's, we've done quite a few things in the recent past. We've launched a literature review, which has been a thorough review of all the extant and published literature, because it's our assertion that regenerative thinking is based in science and based in truth and practice. And we've been very pleased to find that when you do study the literature, and there's quite a lot of literature about various different regenerative techniques, quite a lot of them you can quite clearly prove are effective, and there's quite a few more where the science has been emergent. We haven't yet got to the point of conclusive proof, but we're moving in that direction, and there's a lot more science building. So Becky, let's have a look at the next slide. I can't remember what's on it. Here we go. So yes, these are some of the generic bodies and things that we align with. I've talked a little bit about them. Let's just rewind a little bit and think about, what is the term regenerative? Where's it come from? And why is this sort of emerging now? Because the practices on and of themselves, each of the individual practices, are not entirely new. They are things that different people around the world have practiced at various times. But the word regenerative is one that's been applied to farming, particularly in agriculture, a lot in the recent, let's say, 15 or 20 years. And it's actually been a movement, and probably this movement probably originated in the States, and it was actually after the Dust Bowl, when people overplowed their fields and lost a lot of their topsoil. It effectively blew away, and they were unable to carry on farming in places. And there have been quite a few examples in the past of civilization collapses as a result of overworking and overfarming land. And it was actually in those the 30s and 40s, as they were recovering from that the US Department of Agriculture started to study what the problem was. And one of the problems was ploughing the soil and not planting anything in its place and having bare land. And that just allows for the wind and the water to erode the topsoil and it to blow away. And so no-till farming very much started there, where you always have something in the ground. As soon as you harvest your crop, you plant something else, so you never have bare soil. And the no-till movement, and those of you who listen to the Archers or other such agricultural soap operas may well have heard of no-till some perhaps 20 years ago. But the word regenerative has become applied to a suite of activities in farming that focus on rebuilding the soil and rebuilding the soil health and the soil microbial activity, so that the soil is no longer depleting and no longer at risk of eroding. So just to set the context in terms of viticulture, when it comes to how does it stand in the list of agricultural activities, there's about 800 million hectares of cropland in the world, and of that 7.2 million are planted to vineyards. That is decreasing at the moment because people are pulling vines out in a few different places, but it is around 7.2 million, and that's just less than 1% of cropland, which is not a huge amount, but it is the land that we folks in the wine world have some influence over and some control over. And it is a lot of 7.2 million hectares is a lot of land. And if we can influence people who are growing grapes on that land to improve their practices and to improve their soil carbon and to work in a way that suits the environment and biodiversity better, then we will have done a very good job. And that is what our mission is over the next few years, is to convert the majority of those people to understanding how to farm in a better way and to incorporate more carbon in their soil. Also, vineyard land, don't forget, punches well above its weight in terms of share of voice. So I think there's also an opportunity for us to shout loudly about regenerative practices and start to influence other crop areas as well, who perhaps don't get the press coverage and the interest that the wine world does. And if we can use wine as a champion category to say, look what you can do with your land, then perhaps other people might follow. And I suppose lastly, there is an increasing concern and an increasing amount of knowledge about what the chemicals we have been using on our land potentially are doing with residues that are left in the soil, and perhaps that might transfer into the food we eat and the negative effects that that might be having. That science is only going to get more precise and more able to show us what those damages might be. And there is, as if you're a farmer, you'll know that there's a list of chemicals that every year get banned, ones that were okay and are now no longer okay. There's a list of new chemicals or biological extracted elements, often that are useful for farming, that are created. But if you actually understand what a typical vineyard farming conventionally can use at the moment, there's quite a wide scope of things that are used, and not many wineries really want to open their chemical cupboard to public scrutiny. And I think as those the consumers who are drinking wine and the people who are wanting to talk about how wine is made are starting to understand that, I think more and more wineries will make the decision that they really need to jump the side of the fence where they're really diminishing whatever they're using that is potentially creating negative effects. This is a great slide. This is actually a picture in Penedès. Stephen and I went to visit a few growers down there, and he took us to one of his vineyards on the right, bang next to a neighbour that 30 or 40 years ago had been farmed the same way, that he had farmed quite considerably differently. And you can't see very well here, but there's a difference in the soil level of about 9 inches. And if you look over closely at the roots of the vines on the left, quite a lot of them, the actual roots are exposed. So we've all seen vineyards where you've got a vine coming out of the ground and the graft is visible, and the graft probably should just be visible above the surface of the ground. But sometimes the graft is now 6 inches above the ground, and you can start to see where the roots split up and diverge because the soil that held those roots has just disappeared. The one on the right obviously is farmed with grass cover, very diverse grass cover. It's not seeded, it's just naturally what grows there. And the vineyard soil on the right is much healthier than the soil on the left. And you can see that carbon, which leaves the soil as carbon dioxide, and water leaves the soil as evaporation, leaving fairly devoid of life soil, whereas the other soil actually brings carbon into the soil through respiration of the plant, locks it up in the plant carbon and also in the root exudate that it feeds to the creatures that live under the soil. It also captures and holds water much better. So we talked a little bit about perhaps the 4 levels of viticulture: conventional, sustainable, organic, and biodynamic. In terms of percentage of vineyards farming under those systems, we reckon that biodynamic is still under 1% of vineyard area. Organic, we know, has hit 6%, maybe now at 7 or 8% of vineyard area, although that growth is slowing a bit at the moment. And then sustainability is very hard to pin down because there are so many different new sustainability certifications. And they all have different hurdles and different rates. In New Zealand, I think 98% of the vineyards in New Zealand conform to their sustainability certification, so they're all in, whereas in other places perhaps they aren't so advanced with getting people into the sustainability certification. But it's still only 20%. And so we're very interested in the conventional growers who haven't yet made a move. We really want to influence them to make positive steps. And we think that everyone at every level of certification can improve their soil health. So we're really focused on the soil health as a sort of metric of how that, of what you can do at each level. And at each level, we think soil health can be improved. So both conventional, sustainable, organic, and biodynamic can all massively increase their soil health using regenerative farming techniques. And conversely, there are some practices that organic producers may use, which are commonly used to control weeds, is ploughing. and another chemical that is used by the organic producers, and let's not get away from the fact that it is a chemical, even though it's extracted from the earth, copper in its various forms, is pretty negative for soil health. And there's that awful map of if you look at Northern Europe, at copper in the soil, the copper in the soil massively coincides with the wine producing regions. Languedoc, bits of Spain, most of northern Italy, like horribly overdosed on copper. And so there's a lot of people who are farming organically, who still use a lot of copper, probably less than their neighbours, but still it's the only thing they can rely on, and therefore they're using it a lot for various forms of fungal disease. So we do think that whichever level you're at, you can improve your soil with regenerative techniques, and if you ignore the teachings of regenerative, you can have actually quite poor soil. So just a sort of summary, regenerative viticulture is a sort of overarching philosophy, but it is led by science. And I think personally, it's one of the reasons I'm very attracted to it. And as soon as I started to grasp the key message of regenerative farming, which is that the plant roots in the soil, if they're there all the time, are continuously transpiring, continuously taking sunlight, taking water and taking carbon dioxide, making new plant material, and then feeding the soil microbiology through their roots. And if you allow them to do that, the soil microbiology develops to a level of diversity and complexity that means you have a stable biodiverse system that then is a bit more resistant to threats and diseases, and is an entirely a more healthy way to go about things. And it allows for a certain amount of self-fertility, where the plants themselves are commissioning the minerals they need from the soil rather than having them applied from the outside, are creating the nitrogen needed to produce healthy growth. And a vineyard manager's job is to encourage the plants that do that, and in some cases by seeding them, by assisting them, in other cases by getting to a balanced system that manages itself. Now, none of these, well, most of these practices are not new. It's the bringing of them together under an umbrella and understanding that the goal is a healthy, diverse ecosystem with multiple species, and trying to manage that as a whole and not just look at it as a crop where you're trying to produce a product. So we're trying to look at things not from an extractive point of view where you're mining the earth for its minerals and the capacity to produce your crop, but you're actually trying to steward a plot of land for a long period of time into the future, whereby you're trying to keep a level of fertility and productivity at an acceptable economic level over a period of time. So therefore the focus is not on dominating nature, it's on trying to work with it, understanding what nature wants to do, letting it do that when it serves you, and trying to prevent it in natural ways where you can when you don't want to do what it wants to do. There is also the quite exciting practice of, I think that one of the problems of traditional certifications is they get locked in and people just follow the plan and just do that and think that's what they're doing for the rest of their lives. They're not thinking about their viticulture. They're just doing what their dad did or what they were told at university or agricultural college, or what their rep, who comes from normally from the company that sells them the chemicals, their agronomist, tells them they need to do. The joy of regen is continuously rethinking and re-looking and paying attention to what's happening and adapting. And it does require alertness and attention, but it's actually also a slight awakening for people to realize that this is not just a question of going out and looking at the calendar and saying it's time to do this. It's much more a question of understanding what's needed. There's quite a lot of overlap with organic and biodynamic, and it overcomes a lot of the objections. I've personally, and I'm sure many of you too, been intrigued by a lot of organic and particularly biodynamic producers, and some astonishingly good wines that are made biodynamically. Is there a causal link that's the biodynamics that makes the wine better? Is it just very careful, caring producers who go to all the trouble of doing biodynamics, who make better wine? We don't really know, but there are some parts of the old biodynamic belief system that are a little bit hard to sign up to if you're trained in a relatively scientific mindset. And what I think that regen does is takes the elements that are provably true. It takes the same idea of it's a whole system, that you need to get the whole system in balance, but it applies a little bit of reason why to that. And actually, many of the techniques that biodynamics uses are beneficial and can be shown to be beneficial. Some of the other elements perhaps are less provable and need to be experienced. And I don't dismiss the fact that if you've experienced that, if you plant something on a rising moon or you use a horn rather than something else to bury your compost, if you've observed that, then you believe in it for sure. But I think it's good to be able to scientifically prove it. And it appeals to me because I think you can attract the attention of people who've ruled out biodynamics because of the mystical element, but who are, able to be persuaded by the science. I think that's come to the end of what I was going to say. Becky, I think, am I right that you're taking over next? And have you got your mic on? Yes, there we are.
I am taking over next. Yes. Hello, I'm Becky. Thank you, Justin. That was great. So Justin's done the introduction to the why of regenerative viticulture, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what the different aspects are, what the practices are that we think are useful, and the things that we're doing at the RVF to support growers and try and move them along their journey. So our understanding of soil has changed a lot in recent years, and I think it's very similar to, we talk a lot about our gut microbiome at the moment, and our understanding of that has changed a lot, and I think it's very relatable. The soil has a similar microbiome, and there's all sorts of statistics about how many bugs there are in the soil, but there's more than there are people on the planet, and all sorts of other things. During the course of its life, a plant forms a symbiotic relationship with the microbes in the soil. Justin mentioned that it creates carbohydrates, and it gives out these as root exudates. It gives these out to the microbes in the soil. It keeps about 60 to 70% of the carbohydrates for itself, and it gives about 30 to 40% to the soil and sends signaling messages for different nutrients that it's looking for. So these relationships, especially with the mycorrhizal fungi, which are a type of fungi that grows into the roots, so it's a signaling process, and it extends the reach of the roots by many times over. So conventional viticulture, we do quite a lot to kind of disrupt that relationship. So by ploughing, we cut up these networks. By applying fertilizers, the plants no longer have to feed the microbiome to get those macronutrients. And then by using fungicides, some of those fall on the ground. And obviously that's not great for a lot of the fungi in the soil either. There are 5 key principles of regenerative farming. This we've borrowed from a different type of agriculture. So actually has wheat in there, which obviously we don't grow. But these principles still apply to viticulture. We try not to disturb the soil. We try to keep the soil covered to give it armor against the elements. We want to grow a diverse range of crops. Obviously, the vine is perennial. We don't move the vine, but there's lots of space beneath the vines for growing different crops to have a polyculture. We want to keep living roots in the soil so that those weeds can act like mini solar panels all year round. And integrating animals is something not every vineyard can achieve, but if they can, it introduces manure and other activities. So those are our 5 key principles. And one of the things we're finding in keeping the ground covered is that with the process of climate change at the moment, we're getting these extremely high temperatures in some of the traditional wine regions. This image with the different colours is quite striking, because what you're seeing there in the red is a ploughed field and the temperature's reaching 48 degrees centigrade. And then you can see in the blue, those are fields that have got ground cover. So there is a huge difference between the ground that's covered and the ground that isn't covered. And temperatures in the 40s of the ground, well, that obviously really damages the microbes in the soil. And it also increases evapotranspiration, so the soil's losing a lot of water. So if we minimize the tillage and herbicide use, we can keep that ground covered, we can keep the temperatures lower, keep the water in the soil. One of the other things is that, as you all know, vineyards are often on slopes, on inclines, and those rows go down the slopes. And often what happens at the moment is we get these cycles of drought where we get very little rainfall. And then we suddenly get these high precipitation events where we get a huge amount of rain coming down. And what happens is it washes the topsoil down the slopes, washes the nutrients away, takes a lot of nitrogen, pollutes the rivers, and then we don't have any topsoil or nutrients left in the vineyard. So these cycles of drought and then fires and then flood are increasing and are, you know, affecting vineyards as well as other forms of agriculture. So there are people doing interesting things to try to slow down the water as it moves through the vineyard and store it in basins in the vineyard so that any rain that does fall, you can have for later when you need it. And also people are starting to change the orientation of their rows, which is quite challenging. So it's called keyline contouring. So the rows kind of hug the hillside, a bit like in the Douro. But it does make it a challenge for trellising. You have to plant the vines first and then work out the trellising afterwards. But it does stop a lot of the big erosion of soil in the vineyards. So instead of having the bare soil that was considered to be a sign of a very well-kept vineyard a long time ago, and probably still is in some places, to me, this is a beautiful vineyard with lots of cover crops growing there. So there are different ways of keeping the ground covered. You can just allow the weeds or volunteer plants, as some people like to call them, to just regenerate, so regenerate the sward naturally. Or you can encourage different plants by sowing them, and those plants have different roles. So the one on the bottom left there, it's a daikon. I think that's how you pronounce it. And that obviously is, I think it's a type of radish, has an enormous root that will help kind of with compaction. So where you've got in conventional, or in all vineyards really, where the tractors drive up and down all the time, that soil gets very compacted. And if you can grow things like this, it breaks up the soil, gives and allows earthworms to loosen the soil as well. And the flowering plants are good for pollinators, and you get these beneficial insects. So you can kind of have lots of different services from choosing your cover crops very carefully. And leguminous ones, so that's from the pea and bean family, they can fix nitrogen in little nodules on the roots. That's the middle photo on the bottom. So there's people now kind of being very careful with what plants they grow for different purposes in amongst the vines. Another really core practice is to introduce lots of organic matter to try and replace a lot of that soil organic matter that is lost every year. So every year, obviously, we remove the grapes, the crop from the vineyard, and that takes a lot of soil organic matter out of the vineyard, and then we prune almost all of that year's growth, and people used to take that away or burn it because of worries about disease and things like that. But now generally people will leave the prunings on the ground, on the floor, and they'll chop them up into tiny bits so that the earthworms can do their job and pull them down into the soil. And they will start to bring in compost and manure, and they can make the compost from things like the grape pressings and from lots of other waste streams that can be local or from on the farm. Lots of people are trying to achieve a kind of closed farm loop as this ideal, which is very difficult. Most people don't achieve it, but if you can reuse what you've got in the form of compost and then apply that to the vines, then you're replacing a lot of that soil organic matter. Biochar, that's what's shown in someone's hand. It's a little bit like charcoal, and you may have heard of that. It's a way of introducing a type of carbon that's stored over a very long period of time in the soil. So people are taking vine prunings, or they're clearing the understory of the forest around their vineyard. They're burning that in very low oxygen, and then that locks the carbon up in there, and they compost it down with the compost and then apply it to the vines. And then obviously animals, well, we have those on the left there. That's Hartenberg Wine Estate, where they have cows, and they get the cows to actually they're quite interesting because they provide salt licks for the cows, and they put their cover crop seeds in the salt licks. So then the cows they lick the salt lick, and then they wander around, and they poo out the seeds all around the vineyard. So it's their way of actually sowing the seeds with their own fertilizers. So that's quite clever. And you might wonder about whether the cows do damage to the vines, but actually they've got these very cool big yellow brushes at the end of the rows that the cows rub themselves against. So people are coming up with these very clever ways of doing things. And the sheep, some people are coming up with ways of having the sheep all year round. Most of the time, the sheep are only there during the vine dormancy, during the winter, because people worried the sheep are going to eat the leaves or eat the grapes. But some people are kind of designing these high trellis wires so that the sheep can go through the vineyard all year round. So there's lots of kind of really innovative things that people are doing. We talk about agroforestry a lot because what's happened over the last few decades is that as our machinery has got bigger, our vineyards, a lot of the hedgerows and the remaining trees, remnant trees they call them, have been removed to allow for the passage of machinery, which has been very convenient, but it means that we've lost a lot of the biodiversity and the wildlife corridors. So people are starting to reintroduce these, and this could be as simple as something as reintroducing hedgerows that are linking up different wildlife corridors or forests or rivers. But some people are actually planting trees very intentionally in amongst the vines. And there are different kind of patterns of doing that. Some is to maybe replace every row, maybe every 10 rows or something like that, replace it with a lot of trees. Some people are planting little copses within the vineyard, and some people are even just replacing individual vines, maybe if they die, replacing that with a tree. And they're using fruit trees, they're using woodland trees, and there's lots of clever experimentation with different methods of pruning the trees at the same time as the vines, trying to make sure that you can still have your passage of machinery down through the rows. So a lot of thought is going into that. The trees themselves are fantastic because they can take a lot of water down into the soil that they can then it evapotranspires in the summer, and it can slightly affect the humidity around the vineyard. So it's really good for reducing air temperatures in the summer and increasing that resilience to heat waves. Their roots hold the soil together, they prevent soil erosion. Obviously, they provide a lot of habitat for birds and bats and all sorts of pollinating, all sorts of kind of wasps and bees and things like that. And they can sequester and store a lot of carbon in the soil. So there's lots of exciting things happening at the moment. Justin was talking earlier about the science, and agroforestry is one area where people are experimenting, even though they haven't yet got the science in many cases to actually really back up what they're doing. But because it takes so many years for trees to grow, actually they're not going to wait to find out. I went to visit Chateau Cheval Blanc last year, and they were absolutely adamant that they were not going to wait 10 years for someone else to do a study, but they wanted to just crack on with it and see how it worked themselves. So yes, trees are very good for bats and birds. Bats are fantastic for eating moths that cause damage to the grapes. And some birds like the barn owls, there's a lot of work going on with barn owls, especially in California, showing that they can, as they have a problem there with gophers and voles, some of these rodents that can girdle the vine, and that really damage the roots. But a family of barn owls, this is quite gruesome, can eat their way through over 1,000 gophers in a growing season. So there's lots of experimentation on that, and there are some quite gruesome videos where you can watch the parents bringing all these rodents in through the hole in the barn outbox. But yes, but all sorts of, they call it green infrastructure. All these ecological infrastructures are fantastic. So dry stone walls are great for lizards, wildflowers are great for beneficial insects, and all these things can work towards massively reducing insecticide use. And that is somewhere that we've been having a lot of success with, I think, globally, that people are coming up with ways to encourage natural predators onto their vineyards so that they don't have to use as many insecticides. Yes, so I've put this slide in because when you think about the different kinds of synthetic chemicals, agrochemicals that are used in vineyards, we have herbicides like glyphosate against weeds, obviously. We have synthetic agrochemicals against fungal diseases. We have insecticides against insects, pests. But yet we talk a lot about terroir, and we talk about that very much in relation to fine wine. But really, to me, the more I've been kind of involved in this, and I've been deep in regenerative viticulture for 2 years now, it feels to me that actually the terroir comes from the soil, the actual soil, and that relies so much on the relationship between the vine and what is in the soil microbiome. So, you know, I do think that regenerative viticulture can really give us a much finer sense of terroir. That's my belief anyway. Right, so how is the RVF helping growers? I better move on a bit more quickly because I've realised that we're not going to have time for all this. Justin mentioned the literature review. We essentially looked at almost every aspect of conventional viticulture and then looked at where there was evidence behind regenerative practices. And what we found out was that some things have really strong evidence. Cover crops have really strong evidence. No-till has really strong evidence. Mulches has very strong evidence. And activities that enhance functional biodiversity are the same. But what we did find is that because vineyards are so unique and there's so much variability in their context, in soils, in their climate, in everything, that we need a lot more studies in lots of different types of vineyards. And the other thing is that when you do a scientific study, it's quite easy to do a simple study that's you change one or two things and you have a control and you see how those things, what the effect is. Actually, it's quite hard to do a study into an entire ecosystem because you're looking at so many different strands and how they interact with each other, and you're looking over 5 or 10 years to see what the impact is. So that's what we need. We need more long-term studies. Excuse me. So then we produced something called the RV Guide. This is essentially a questionnaire where we get growers to sign up to the questionnaire and then answer questions on their current practices in their vineyard on 16 different topics, and also how confident they feel in making changes to these 16 different areas. Sorry, I'm just going to have some water. Justin and I have touched on, I think, almost all of these topics as we've been talking. And what we have is for each one, these 2 questions is that, oh, sorry, going to go to the questions first. So the first one is, how confident do people feel in their ability to make a change in this area? And this is building a picture for us of where people need the most support. And then the second one is them telling us what they're actually doing in that area so that we can see what practices are being implemented where. And then at the end of this questionnaire, they can choose to be included on our map. So we have this map of growers that are interested in farming vines regeneratively. It's not a certification, it's not independently verified, but it's what it's doing, and this is the absolute beauty behind it, is that it's helping growers find other growers. And I get people contacting me saying, oh, I found this grower who's also introduced sheep into their vineyard, and I've learnt this. And it's fantastic because people can actually get some peer-to-peer support going on, because it can be quite lonely for growers if their kind of existing support network is very conventional and they want to start introducing some regenerative practices. So we've got about 400 and something people who've signed up to it. We've got just under 200 vineyards on this, and we launched it last May. Other ways we're helping people is we're doing webinars with organisations, including the Porto Protocol. We've done 2 on agroforestry, and then the next one is going to be on natural predators in the vineyard to try and reduce insecticide use. We've had one with one of our trustees who's called Kane Thompson. He's in Paso Robles in California. He's done the most incredible documented 3-year transition of his estate vineyards. He transitioned a third of them. He's measured absolutely everything that you could possibly measure, including wine quality at the end, how much it's cost him. And now he's transitioning the rest of his vineyards, though he's always going to keep 5 acres as conventional so that he has a control, so he can see what the difference is between the conventional and the regenerative. I'm not going to go through all his soil analyses or his design, because I think we're going to run out of time for questions if I do that. So our most exciting thing this year is we're doing something called a 1 block challenge, which we've just launched in Paso Robles with Kane. This is because what we've realized is that some people are apprehensive about starting because they think they need to have a fully fledged plan, regenerative plan in their vineyard, and we want them to just start. So what we're saying is just take 1 block. It could even just be 2 rows of vines, and make it your worst block so that you've got the least to lose and the most to gain, and to build a support network around them so that we bring them together with their neighbours. They talk about what their block is, they talk about what the practices are that they're going to try. They teach each other how to do some very simple tests, like how long it takes for a certain amount of water to filter down into their ground so they can see how compacted their soil is. And then over the year, when they introduce cover crops, or they cover their soil, or they bring in organic matter, then they can meet up with each other, have a WhatsApp group, support each other, and then at the end of the year, see whether anything has changed. Admittedly, a year is not a very long time in improving soil health, so it will have to go on for more than 1 year. But the idea is that that they start to see their vineyard with slightly different eyes, and to kind of question that's maybe some of the practices they've already done for many years. People ask us a lot about certification. This seems to be the hot topic at the moment. So we are agnostic on certification. We don't believe people need to be certified. However, we do understand that some people want to be certified. They want to be able to show some verification for what they're doing, avoid greenwashing. And we're starting to hear from some retailers that they actually want to see regenerative certification. So they are proliferating, I would say, certification schemes. So we want to give growers the information they need to help them understand what the difference is between them. Some of them are organic, some of them they don't need to be organic. So there's lots of different things going on. Right, getting towards the end. So examples of some practitioners, because there are some really, really lovely, fantastic people doing lots of things out there. And I will share, I should have said this slightly earlier, we will share the presentation. I can't believe I waited to the end to say that, sorry. We will share the presentation, but so you can look up some of these people. But, oops, it's gone too far. So this top left is Domaine Mirabeau, that's our chairman's vineyard. Next to that is Piscinus Ranch. That is a very exciting, and he's a real educator, Kelly Mulville. It's in California. He has a very high trellis wire, and he puts his vines, his sheep through the vines all year round. Next to that with the dog, that is Greystones in New Zealand. And they're hosting a regenerative festival this week, which is quite exciting. The top right we've already seen, that's Hartenberg. I'm going to go clockwise. So the next one down is Bonterra in California. And they're doing some really lovely things there. Below that is a small vineyard called St. Mary in Oregon. Then we have Matt Robson, he's at Harrow and Hope, the Laithwaites vineyard in west of London. He is a man who's very proud of his compost heaps. He likes to put his thermometer in there to check the temperature. And then we have Chateau Cheval Blanc at the bottom there with one of their trees they planted in amongst their vines. Then we have I might get this wrong, a llama, might be an alpaca, a llama at Tablas Creek. I'm going to say a llama. You can tell me if I'm wrong. Above that, is Domaine Gassier in France, France's first regenerative vineyard. And then in the middle is lovely Dudley Brown and Irina at Inkwell in California, in Australia. Sorry. So you can see a very common theme is there's a lot of ground cover. Okay, that's it. So are there any questions?
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. And you did a great job of racing through that in 48 minutes. There have been some questions in the chat. I might invite you to stop sharing your screen. And I know Justin has been answering them, typing madly while you've been speaking.
Oh.
But I want to especially invite Heather to come on, because Heather, you had a number of questions, and I know some of them have been answered, but I'm sure given your engagement and interest in this, you might want to just get some more questions answered. I think you're muted, or at least we can't hear you. Nope, can't hear you. Maybe,
No, I'm not sure why not.
Well, I could start with one of your questions that I read in the chat. Heather asked about how long it takes for soil to form, which is an interesting geological question. You also asked, Heather, about natural wines and how regenerative and natural wines knit together, and then the messaging for consumers about regenerative viticulture practices.
I better dive in and answer before Becky contradicts what I said in the chat, before she has a chance to read it. I'm going to dive off in about 5 minutes, so I'll perhaps answer this and then disappear.
Sure.
It certainly used to be said that it takes 1,000 years to create an inch of topsoil, and it is a very precious substance, but actually you can create it much, much, much quicker than that if you're very intentional and very focused on trying to do that. If you bring a lot of organic matter into your vineyard, the ultimate aim is to be self-sufficient and have the land create its own fertility, but you can bring in products from outside to start you off, notably biochar and notably organic compost. And then once you've got plants growing in the soil, those plants they're metabolizing and producing carbon products through photosynthesis every year. And if you keep them in the vineyard, and the one thing you have to take out of the vineyard is the grapes, but try and make sure the leaves, the stems, as much as possible can be composted and brought back into the vineyard, then you will gradually increase your organic matter. And you can take bare soil and create bare earth, dirt, and create soil remarkably quickly. If you read Gabe Brown's book, Dirt to Soil, that is a foundational text of regenerative agriculture, and lots of people quote it as very influential on helping them understand how quickly they can move forward. And a few years is probably the answer.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I changed something. Thank you. And that was really interesting, because sometimes, when you're driving along and it's rainy and you see soil literally being washed across a road, and you think, how long did that take to happen, and how long will it take to replace if they even try? But on the organic side of things and what consumers understand, I think people they think, okay, I know organic's a good thing, so I'll sort of hold on to that. But as far as regen goes, how much do they actually need to know? Is this something that we just say, okay, people do it, and maybe suppliers need to get some sort of certification if they're required to, but it just sort of get out of the way of consumer messaging and just do what needs to be done?
Well, it's a very good question and very relevant to wine writers who are trying to communicate. And I suppose the question I'd say is, how do consumers get to understand a subject like this? And the answer is by having it patiently explained to them by people who know and care in a way that makes it interesting. And I think that will happen slowly. It'll happen faster with lots of people talking about regen in other contexts. If people watch Kiss the Ground or The Biggest Little Farm, or there's a nice film called 6 Inches of Soil, those kind of films that are really advocating for it, they'll learn quicker. And then there are big companies now going hard onto a regen method because they think that can grow better crops with better environmental credentials. McCain Chips, McDonald's, Nestle even, I think, have decided to put a bid back on regen, and they are shifting the needle on large tracts of farmland. So I think there will be in the next 5 or 6 years a building understanding. And we're here to help that movement forward and to help people explain what it's all about. Becky, do you have anything to add to that? And I'm going to disappear at this point, so I shall.
Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Justin.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye bye.
Yes, so no, really all I would say is that some of it is slowly seeping into consumer kind of brains, and wild farmed. I don't know if anyone's seen wild farmed bread at Waitrose.
Oh,
If that's Becky,
regeneratively
if
farmed
that's
wheat.
oh,
That's sorry, did you lose me?
no, it's all right, Becky. You just froze for a minute there. You froze for a minute, but you're back.
Sorry about that. Yes, I was just talking quickly about wild farmed wheat, which is in Waitrose, and the Andy Cato, the pop star, who is part of that brand. He was on Jeremy Clarkson's Farm TV program. So that, who knows the way that the consumer will get to know about it. What I do know is that that we've been told that what consumers really want is for the retailer to have done that work for them already. So we talk about, do we need to invest our rather limited resources in getting to the consumer? Actually, if you talk to someone like Dom DeVille at the Wine Society, he thinks that actually they just want the retailer to already have made all those decisions, because no matter what they really say and think about going to choose their wine, and they think they're going to go and buy organic or biodynamic or regenerative, actually when they go into the shop to buy it, they kind of slightly freeze and just buy what they normally buy anyway. Sorry, wine writers.
Does put a lot of the onus on the buyer, doesn't it? We thank you for that. We do have a number of other questions here. Jean-Marc asks about the mystical element of biodynamics and whether you believe that's held regenerative back. Jean-Marc, do you want to unmute and ask your question and expand on that, or? He's unmuting. There we go.
Yeah, hi, sorry. Yeah, it sounds like regenerative covers all the scientific elements that are in biodynamic. But for me personally, with a scientific background, every time you get to a certain point with biodynamic, it's all the mystic things, the burying a stag's bladder with yarrow. It doesn't sound scalable. It doesn't sound, even logical. And I'm wondering if that sort of mystic is the nicest way I can put it, has held the movement back at all, or is regenerative potentially a reaction to some of those elements in biodynamic?
I don't think it's held it back, because we don't have any of the spiritual aspects in regenerative. And I do know that people who grow biodynamically, even very scientific people, and I do have both a scientific degree and masters, so I'm quite a scientist as well. I do know that the people who grow biodynamically really passionately believe in it, even and I think a lot of it is the attention to detail, rather than, and actually also I think that some of these herbs and plants that are growing around, if you use them then on the vines, are starting to emerge some scientific evidence behind that. So I don't think it's held regenerative back, because I think we're seen as being quite separate. I think there are overlaps with a lot of the practical aspects.
Right.
Fair enough. I'm still going to struggle with stirring the water 3 times clockwise and 1 times back, but that's fine.
So we had a question fairly early on, and I don't know whether it was addressed. It was Patricia Stefanovic asking about copper in the soil. And, I think that obviously for replanting that inhibits the program, but when you're trying to move toward regenerative process and you've been working organically and you have a high copper buildup, what are some of the issues there?
So I don't know about replanting into heavily contaminated copper soils. I do know that there's a problem with taking sheep onto contaminated copper soils, because they get a buildup of toxicity in their livers. So there are many issues with copper, and it is one of the really fundamental kind of debates that we have within regenerative viticulture, as some people very firmly believe that you shouldn't use any synthetic chemicals at all, and some people very firmly believe that copper is a very bad thing to use. What do you use against downy mildew? And there are now emerging some interesting biological solutions, but they haven't yet fully emerged. So there is hope, I think, that this will happen. But it's interesting because in the US, regenerative organic is a very popular certification, and that's because they don't have the problems we have with copper use and downy mildew. They don't have downy mildew, do they? So in California, so it's easier to be organic, and therefore there isn't the same argument about copper use. So yes, it's tricky. It's tricky.
Thank you. I think Fred Leumer is just just reading it now, just dropped a comment in the chat about biodynamics. Fred, do you want to come on and have a brief discussion here about? There he is. I think he's coming in. Can't hear you yet, Fred.
It's now better. Do you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So I was very interested today to see that discussion about regenerative viticulture, and we talk and discuss that a lot. But I think what I see in the comments, there's a few misunderstandings about biodynamic. So it's for sure not a believer system. Of course, in the last 20, 30, 40 or 100 years since it is existing, all the discussions are starting with the preparates. I don't know why, but maybe it's curious, and so people asking for. But biodynamic is 99% the same what you show today. So we do green cover since 30 years. We do try to get biodiversity. We have sheep since 2007. So all of that is important when you want to farm biodynamic. And the thing is that the preparates, I think it's first of all, there are a lot of science works where they show that preparates have an influence. And for me, they also have a big influence to the people who are using that way of farming, because the preparates makes you very sensitive, and you get more awareness, and you get more sensitiveness to see your troubles in the fields. And so preparates have two directions, one to the farmers itself and one to the field and to the plants and to the soil. And nature is everything on the world is complex systems, but nature is the most complex system we have in the world. And it's not easy to check with a few things like compost or whatever, or fertilizers, the soil life and to make the soil better. I think there has to be a deep, holistic, systemic understanding to farm correct today and to farm regenerative or biodynamic. And whatever I saw today is, I think this agricultural farming course in 24, I'm not a fan of Steiner, but he made a few things, he had a few ideas, which is the basic of everything today. Permaculture, regenerative farming, organic farming, biodynamic farming, everything is based on that course.
If I could just jump in
And when I
quickly.
understand it right,
sorry.
and the problem in viticulture, just a second, the problem of viticulture is we work with monoculture, we work with an old genetic plant, and it need help, and this is spraying. And copper is of course not the best thing in the world, but I think the way of organic spraying is much better as the way of conventional spraying. And that's why we are doing that. And yeah, for me, it has nothing to do with a believing system biodynamic. This is really hard work from the base, from the soil on.
Yeah, I think thank you, Fred.
Fred.
Sorry, it's Anne Jones here. I'm sort of tag teaming with Justin today. I've just come in as he left. But just from a Regenerative Viticulture Foundation perspective, I think we'd absolutely agree with everything that Fred has said. I think it's really important to note that we don't consider regenerative and biodynamic to be an either or. They're extremely complementary. They're both about looking at a system holistically, avoiding systemic chemicals and looking at the entire ecosystem. And actually, in many cases, they overlap. It's just a different frame and a different lens. And in most cases, biodynamics uses a lot of regenerative techniques, and regenerative, in fact, overlaps with biodynamics in certain areas. It's just maybe a different framing and a different lens, of people coming to a similar way of sort of attention to detail in their vineyard, but coming from slightly different angles. So I think it's just important to note that we wouldn't consider them to be different systems. We would consider them to be complementary systems.
Thank you, Anne, for that. We are a little over time, so Becky, do you have any final remarks that you'd like to share before we wrap up?
I would just like to say what a lovely audience, and I really like this format. It's fabulous, isn't it? Because we quite often do webinars where you can't see the audience, and there's a barrier between you and the people, the guests and the attendees. And I really like this format where people actually ask questions, and yeah. And I'd just like to say hello to Christine Austin because my very first trip for the RVF, I went to the Torres estate with Christine, and I've learned a lot about regenerative viticulture since then, Christine. I'm sure you'll have noticed. So yes, I just thank you so much for inviting us along, and such thoughtful and intelligent questions. And yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And I'm sorry I had to rush through half of the presentation, but we would have still been here at midnight otherwise. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And we had a request to share the list, as when you share your PowerPoint, the list of those who are on the map, the people who you have identified.
Well, you can go on the map.
Okay, you can go on the map.
Actually, yes. So
Right.
I will share the link to the map. Not everyone has chosen to be publicly visible on the map, but there's about 140 vineyards that have chosen to be public. And it's a fantastic way of getting a sense of who's doing what and where. So yes, please go on the map. Please go on the map. Fabulous.
Thank you, Becky.
Oh, and if you want to know more about regenerative viticulture, all the information that is in that guide, in that questionnaire, is also available on our website on a section called Resources Toolkit. So the toolkit is the place to go. It has a glossary of information. It has information about certification, and then it has a huge amount of resources that are on the guide for vineyard owners. And please do email me if you ever want to know anything, because I quite enjoy answering people's emails.